Hi, this is Todd Davis from Seabury Design. Welcome to the second part of my video series, and what I'm going to do today is try to explain the data access layer and business logic layer to you, and we're actually going to go ahead and create that layer today. And this is probably going to be the toughest part of the whole series. Everything else is cake from here on. The data access layer is really not as complicated as people make it out to be sometimes, but there is a little bit to it, and so it does take some getting used to and some familiarity. Let's take a look at the diagram on the right hand side here. I think this helps a lot to explain what's going on. Here we have our application layer, our business logic layer, and our data access layer. And if you're familiar with client server, then a lot of this is going to be very familiar to you. On the top end, we have our DotNetNuke application, which is going to need to process data and request data in its own way. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have SQL Server, and it's going to process data and require calls from DotNetNuke to be in a certain format. And so we need some way for these two applications to talk to each other, the client and the server. And our data access layer is really going to be the vehicle that does that for us. The data access layer is technically composed of about 5 components, and those components are the info object. And the info object is really nothing more than a class with a bunch of properties exposed. It's going to be a very simple way for us to store the information to pass back and forth to SQL Server. The controller object is where we actually make the calls to our stored procedures, and we're going to make calls from here that would say on something like add blog, update blog. The controller object will actually then speak to the SQL data provider, and the reason that I have this data provider right here is because SQL data provider actually inherits from data provider, and we're going to see that all these things, the controller, data provider, and SQL data provider, are going to have similar functions in them, and they all need to be in sync with each other if things are going to work, and this is where all the problems come in, so we're going to look at that. But the SQL data provider is sort of our back end, and it's what's going to talk to SQL Server. So when we need to, let's say, add a new blog, what we'll do is store the blog info in the info object, pass that to the controller object. The controller object will say, okay, SQL data provider, I need to add a blog, and the SQL data provider will call the stored procedure that will do that. Not really too complicated, and of course things will work reverse. When we need to return data, we'll pass it back through here, through the controller objects, store the info in an info object where DotNetNuke can look at it and pull out whatever info it needs. Okay? I think the best place to start is we're going to go over to SQL Enterprise Manager, and let's create a table, and we're going to base all of our data access layer from this table. So create a new table. Now you should be familiar with a lot of this, but again we're going to have some module specific things here. The very first thing we're going to do is add a blog ID, make that an integer. Okay, and that's going to be our primary key, and just to make life easy, I'm going to go ahead and say yes, it's an identity with an increment of 1. Now, before we start adding blog-specific things, what you need to consider is that this is a module, and this module may appear on several different pages or in several different locations within your DotNetNuke portal. It may also appear within several different locations within different portals on your DotNetNuke application. So there's two things we really need to track here that are very important, which is the portal ID, which this comes from or is associated with, and the module ID that this is associated with. And you're going to need those two things in pretty much any custom module that you're going to build. If you don't have them in there, then chances are you're going to have a lot of problems. Now that we have these three things, a blog ID, portal ID, module ID, we can start adding the actual blog items that we need. So we're probably going to have a title to each blog, and I'll make that a varchar of, let's say, 100. and then we're going to have a text value, which is the blog itself. Now there's two ways to go here. One thing we could do is make this a text value, and that would work really great because we could store any amount of info in there. The problem with the text is that you can't use a SQL-like keyword in there, and we might want to search on this later on. So just to make life easy, what I'm going to do is make this a varchar of the maximum 8,000. And two other things I just like to add when I make records is date add and date mod, because you might want to highlight when you have a new record or if a record's been updated, things like that. And I don't think anything here is going to need to be nullable. So we have our table. Let's call it something really complicated like blog. And if you're like me, I like to make things easy. Use the keep it simple stupid method. So we're just going to call that blog. Now we have our table. And now what we really need to do is go back over to our application. I'm just going to shrink this for a minute. And this is where we're going to start talking about those components, the data access layers components we talked about. Remember, we have our info component, blog info, which is going to speak to the controller. The controller is actually going to call our SQL data provider, which inherits from data provider, and the data provider will make the call to our stored procedures. So let's start building things, I think, in that order. This is where we're going to start using another tool. And if you downloaded from DNN Jungle before the templates that I asked you to, here we go, Codesmith, then you'll have something that looks a lot like this, except you'll note that I have a few extras. Now the templates from DNN Jungle are the ones that either start with C# here, or they typically start with VB. Here's your info class, controller class, data provider, SQL data provider, and stored procedures. That's your 5 parts. I have modified these a little bit, and I'm going to use my modified classes here. And I'll tell you why real quickly, is that I like things to remain named the same. When you need to track down, again, let's say we did an add blog. I want to call add blog at the controller. When the controller calls SQL data provider, it should call add blog, and that should call a stored procedure called add blog. And that way, when you need to fix something or update it, it's very clear what those things are called. The original templates name things a little differently. It would call the controller would have a function called add. The SQL data provider would be called add blog, while the stored procedure would be called blog add. And that kind of confuses me. I keep forgetting where I'm at, so I made my own changes. So we're going to use those, and I'm going to make these available for download on the website. You are more than welcome to use the originals and set them up however you like. I'm going to teach you the way that I know, and that I know it works. So let's start out with the info class, and this is SD for Seabury Design, and everything else is pretty much the same. If you click on this and don't have Codesmith installed, you're going to have a problem. There we go. We've opened up this particular template, and here's the first thing I'm going to have you do is go back and open up blog info. Oh, there's one more thing we do need to do here, or we're going to have problems. And let me see if I can, if I open up blog info, I think it might show up. It might not. I'm going to do a control build real quick. And when I do, you'll see all kinds of errors popping up down here. And the reason that these errors are popping up is because you see it's looking for entities, modules, portal module, base. These are DotNetNuke specific things, and the reason we're getting these errors is because we don't have a reference to those things. So real quick, let's go add a reference. Browse. And under the DotNetNuke bin directory, you'll see DotNetNuke DLL. Say OK. A lot of those errors go away. You'll still see a few of them, and the reason you see a few of those is because our SQL data provider doesn't have a reference to .NetNuke. So again, we're going to go up and go up one more. Bin .NetNuke, say OK, and boom, all of our errors are gone. Okay. With that taken care of, now we can continue. Here's our blog info. Blog info, if you remember, I said looks like it's just a bunch of properties that are exposed. And let's take a look at what comes with the original template. Remember now, our original template doesn't know this is a blog module or what we have in our stored procedures, so it really can't have all the pertinent info in it. And they just kind of give you a framework. Here's our module ID, our item ID, which will be blog ID for us, a basic new constructor, and then for each of these private members, we have a public property. Other than that, there's nothing else in here. So let's go and create our own. What I'd like you to do is highlight your namespace and copy it. Do a Control-C. Then go back to your CodeSmith template and paste that in right there. And we're going to need to add a source table here, and I'll show you how to do that. Let's click on the source table, and you see this comes up blank. And if you haven't set this up before, what you're going to need to do is add a data source. And I'm going to say add. I'll call this local. The provider type is SQL. And then for the connection string, I think the easiest way to do this is to go back into DotNetNuke, open up your web config. Just use whatever text editor you like. And I'm going to copy this line right here. And obviously my password isn't going to do you a whole lot of good. And paste it in, and now we have a local. There you go. And here's your blog table. So choose blog and click on generate. And voila, you have a whole blog info module. And if you look here now, you can see we have portal ID, module ID, title, text, all those things we typed in. It went ahead and pulled them in, created a new constructor that takes all these parameters for us, and then exposes all the properties. So we're going to do a Control-A to highlight them, Control-C, go back into Visual Studio, highlight everything, and paste in our new info. And there you go. Now, of course, we're getting errors at this point. The reason that we're getting errors because, remember, everything's going to have to be copacetic between the controller, the data provider, and so on. So let's just keep going for now, and then you'll see these errors disappear when we're all done. The next thing we talked about, the blog info talks to the blog controller. So let's open up CodeSmith. Open SD VBBOL controller class. And here, this is asking for namespace and your data namespace. And again, we're going to cut and paste here. Here's the namespace, ending with business. And here is our data namespace, ending with data. Now, just note that if you're not using my modified CodeSmith templates, if you're using the originals, it's going to expect an object qualifier. So you're going to have to type some object qualifier in there, or put a space in there, or whatever you need to do to get that working. Again, choose the source table, blog, and generate. And here you go. And this should look awful familiar to you. If it doesn't, we're going to take a look at it right now. I'm just going to, again, cut and paste this whole item in. And let's just take a look at it real quick. Here's our blog controller. When we want to add a blog, for example, we're going to define a new object called blog controller, and then we'll call this function add blog, and we'll pass the blog info into it. This function in turn will call our data provider, and it will call an instance of that data provider and call the function within called add blog. And here you can see it's separating out from our blog info the portal ID, the module ID. It's passing all that stuff for us. Okay. Next in line, data provider. This is what SQL data provider is going to inherit from. We're going to go back into CodeSmith, open, SD. Oh, I'm sorry, VB data provider. I don't have a customized one for this because this is a very simple one. What we're going to do is choose our source table. Again, gets very rote after a while. Again, remember, use object qualifier if you're not using my modified ones, or you get that object qualifier. So I'm just going to go in here, type a space, and say generate. And this time you see we don't get a whole page, we just get this little blurb. And these are the functions within data provider, and SQL data provider is going to inherit from these. Again, if you're using my modules, these are all going to look exactly the same as what we saw in controller. Add blog, update blog, delete blog, it's all in there. So I'm going to highlight that, do a Control C, go back in. We're on data provider, but this time I'm not going to highlight the whole page. Here's the original abstract methods from the templates, and we don't need those anymore, so I'm going to highlight that, do a Control V, and now we have everything pasted in there that we need, and I'm going to save that. There's two more steps left. Here's the most obvious one, is we need to go down to our SQL data provider. Okay, and you can see there's a little error popping up here, and we're still getting errors all over the place. SQL data provider must override add blog, blah blah blah. So again, we go back to CodeSmith, open up SD VB SQL data provider, choose blog, choose generate. Oh, I'm sorry. I need SD local stored procedures. Oh, that's not it either. I need SD VB SQL data provider. Put the object qualifier in, blog, and say generate. There we go. Again, we're just going to get a blurb, not the whole page. These are just the methods that we need to replace. I'm going to copy that, go back in, and what we're replacing is the blog methods here. Okay. And again, here everything looks like you would expect it to look. Add blog, update blog, and everything is being passed in here, all of our parameters from the controller. So here's the add blog that is being called by the controller. When I say add blog, it's data provider instance add blog, and it's passing all those parameters. Okay, and what this is going to do is when you add blog here, it's going to activate SQL Helper, and you probably recognize that it's actually part of the Microsoft Data Access block, and that's what's running the show back here on the back end. So it's going to execute a scalar, call our connection string, which is stored in the web config, add the database owner and object qualifier automatically if necessary. Here's the name of the stored procedure it's going to call, and then here's all the things it's going to pass in to the stored procedure. And it takes care of doing all this for you, so you don't have to get real tedious about it. So we are pretty much done on this end. I'm going to rebuild, and let's see. We're still getting an error. Oh, okay, we're getting a couple of errors, and this is because the original framework, the original template, named things a little differently. It put in this call, which is get by modules. We don't have this. It didn't know what we were going to use. So I'm just going to actually rem these out for the meantime. We don't have a get. And you remember I stated before that if you use the templates as provided, they'll just call things get add update where I did not, which is why, see, here's add, here's update. So if you use them out of the box, you won't have to go through this particular step. I don't. Okay. We're going to make one more quick change here, because we want to be able to test out our module as we go along, and we also still need to build our well, you know what, I'm going to wait to make this change. Let's go. We need to build our stored procedures. Otherwise, we won't have anything to call at all. And the reason we're going to do that here now is because we still need our CodeSmith templates. So let's open up and go to ST local stored procedures. Open up log. Generate. And here's all of our stored procedures. And this is nice enough to go ahead and see if the stored procedures exist. If they do, they get dropped, and then we go ahead and create them. So I'm going to do a Control-C, go back into SQL Server. We're already in DotNetNuke, so I'm going to do Tools, SQL Query Analyzer, and paste this in. And I did notice one small problem, and I'll need to fix this before distributing this information. I'm just going to move that comma, and I think everything else is okay. It looks like it. Let's do a check. Yep, and run it. And the command's completed successfully. So if we get out of here real quick, go into stored procedures, I might need to refresh. Oh no, we're okay. Here's our add blog, and you'll see it takes the portal ID, module ID, text, and so forth. We can even blow this up a little bit so you can see it a little better. And it did a real nice job of building all that for us. So we just wrote 5 stored procedures really within seconds, and didn't have to remember what we were passing into it, what the size of the information was. All that was taken care of, and that's where these CodeSmith templates just will save you a ton of time. So that completes our lesson on the doll for now. What we're going to do in the next lesson is go ahead and start testing our module. We're going to have to, as we add components into the module, start tweaking the data access layer a lot. So if you're not real familiar with it, that's okay. I don't expect you to be at this point. We're going to tweak it an awful lot, and you're going to get a lot of experience on how and when to change things. Thanks.